Hey everyone, welcome back. Of course, the weekend that I decided to go on vacation is the weekend that the Wagner Group decides to stage a short-lived military uprising against the Kremlin, over an alleged friendly fire attack, as well as generally the Kremlin's poor performance in the war in Ukraine. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the details of what happened, as that's been covered widely, but what I wanted to talk to you about is how what has happened shows us that Ukraine is getting one step closer to finally achieving victory in this conflict. Now, whenever you have a smaller nation trying to fight off a larger, more powerful aggressor, that smaller nation is almost always going to opt to fight a war of exhaustion. And there are three main criteria for winning a war of exhaustion. Number one, you need to secure foreign support. Let's face it, you're a smaller nation, you're fighting a larger nation with a lot more resources, you're going to need some outside help. Number two, you need to maintain some degree of territorial integrity because your foreign supporters need somewhere to send that support. And if you manage to lose all of your territory, well, you don't really have a country anymore, so generally speaking, you've lost, and that's the end of the war for you. But if you've managed to do those first two things and you manage to stay in the fight, then you can move on to step 3, which is you have to simply outlast your opponent's political will to fight. You're not actually trying to beat them on the battlefield per se, you're just trying to wait it out until your opponent's civilian population back home says, we're done with this war. We don't care about winning it anymore. A great example of this is Vietnam. While the United States was definitely a stronger military power than North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese had foreign support from the USSR and China. They were able to maintain a degree of territorial integrity as there were parts of North Vietnam that the US never invaded. And at the end of the day, they were willing to fight, as the quote goes, 1 year, 1 month, 1 week, 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 second longer than the Americans. And the American domestic population eventually got fed up with the war and called for its end, and the US did withdraw from Vietnam. Now, when you look at Ukraine, we can see that they have successfully achieved 2 of the 3 criteria necessary to win that war of exhaustion. They definitely have a ton of international support, and they've been able to maintain the vast majority of their territorial integrity, with their recent counteroffensive allowing them to even retake some areas previously controlled by the Russians. But that third criteria, breaking the opponent's political will to fight, has remained elusive until recently. Yes, we saw a lot of Russian civilians fleeing conscription, but that's not really resistance against the government. That's more saying, I don't really want to be involved, but I don't really care about the war either way as long as I'm not in it. However, that all changed when the Wagner Group decided to leave the war in Ukraine to march on Moscow. Now, the obvious point of interest is the fact that, despite this being a military rebellion, there were no significant casualties on either side. The Wagner Group was able to take a lot of significant military installations without using any force, and there were no major military reprisals against them from any section of the Russian army, despite the fact that Wagner's stated intent was to remove the head of the Russian army. And while that's very interesting, I think the more important components of this fiasco can be found in what Prigozhin said before this all kicked off, as well as how Russian civilians in these towns reacted. Now, Prigozhin has spent a lot of time criticizing the Russian military brass as well as the Kremlin over how they've conducted this war, but this time he also started questioning the reason they're fighting in the first place, stating that Putin had lied about the reason this war was started and that it really had nothing to do with NATO encroachment. And once you start questioning the reason you're fighting, that's where you start to see that crack form in the political will to fight, because now someone as powerful as Prigozhin has said it, other people are going to start talking about it as well. And I think there's going to be plenty of Russian civilians who are more than happy to explore this topic, as when Prigozhin and his mercenaries marched through several of these towns to occupy these key military installations, the civilian population came out to greet them with coffee and candy, calling them musicians rather than mercenaries. And this overwhelmingly positive support for these mercenaries, and the fact that people weren't really afraid of any reprisals from the Russian government, tells you that people were pretty confident because, again, the Russian government has a long history of some pretty brutal crackdowns, so if the civilian population in these areas is more than willing to come out and show open support for a military rebellion, you know that the Kremlin is in a pretty weak position politically speaking, and again, This is another crack in that political will of the nation to continue this fight. Now, despite the fact that the Wagner Group's rebellion is obviously significant, it was also very short-lived, so don't expect the war to end tomorrow. However, I don't think Putin and the Kremlin have the tools necessary to repair the cracks we're starting to see, and if they don't find a way to fix them, they're inevitably going to get worse. And as the Russians' political will to continue this fight begins to degrade, it's going to become more and more likely that the Ukrainians are going to come out the victors in this war. Think about it.